be fair to assume that this is your Roman Empire. I think this time around.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's fair to say. I'm often thinking of the American Civil War. It kind of permeates everyday life in a really interesting way, and the kind of philosophical mindset and kind of character of the South. They had gotten themselves in this really difficult bind, and even when they realised this and they started to try and invest in industrialising, it was seen to go against the grain of kind of Southern culture, the Southern way of life, because it was seen to be very grubby. He and his sons hacked to death 5 pro-slavery men in Kansas as part of this kind of maniacal sort of messianic drive to wipe out slavery. It's a very, very controversial act because it angers Northerners because they feel like, hang on a minute, we here do not practice this abomination. Why should we be asked to assist those who do?
Welcome to the Echo Changer podcast with myself, Jacob.
And myself, Harley.
So yeah, this is episode 11 now. We're really catching on here. This is going good.
Racing along.
Yeah, we've already covered some very interesting topics already, and yeah, we're ready to give you some more juicy insights into the historical world. But yeah, Harley, why don't you take it away with what our topic is going to be today?
Yeah, so as I've hinted at, or more than hinted at, really, as I've kind of railroaded you a few times with, it's the American Civil War is a subject I'm quite interested in. So today is going to be a sort of general kind of introduction to the American Civil War, focusing on the sort of basics, things that perhaps, all of it really is stuff that we wouldn't have been taught at school in the British education system. I don't think I've ever seen it on a history syllabus. It may have been on one somewhere, but I've certainly never come across anyone who was taught it. So I think we're going to be led by that and the notion that we're going to try not to get bogged down too much in the details and just give a general sort of overview, after which at some point in the future we might do more specific facets.
Yeah, obviously quite a similar structure to what we're going to try and do with a lot of the topics that we cover is obviously we'll kind of go with a general overview of a certain period of history or a certain topic. And then later down the line, obviously, we're able to revisit specific people, events, battles, you name it. We can kind of cover it in more detail later. But yeah, I mean, I would say it would be fair to assume that this is your Roman Empire. I think this time around.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's fair to say. I'm often thinking of the American Civil War, and in particular, I think it comes back to, as I've mentioned before, I'm half American. My American half is Southern, from North Carolina, and I go there every year to visit my dad. So it's kind of in the blood to a certain extent, especially in the South. The Civil War they've never really gotten over it, which you could say in the South they've never really gotten over it, and it kind of permeates everyday life in a really interesting way, and the kind of philosophical mindset and kind of character of the South is kind of deeply affected, scarred, you might say, by the sort of trauma of the Civil War. And that crops up in a lot of ways, sometimes in the lost cause myth, which we probably won't get into today too much, but it is the sort of fallacious notion that it's a sort of Southern whitewashing of the Civil War history, which attempts to say that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but was instead about states' rights. Of course, as soon as you dissect that, you have to say, well, the states' rights to do what? The answer to which is to own slaves. So it's a sort of semantic game that certain Southerners play to this day, kind of neo-Confederates, or just sort of Confederate sympathizers, and all that kind of stuff. So it's a fascinating one, and you see it when you go to the battlefields. You see people with sort of Dixie flags on their shirts and their caps and all that kind of stuff. As I've mentioned before, it's central to the statues debate and more than a debate as it turned out to be in 2020. And so I just find it fascinating. It's everywhere when you're there in the South, and I'm excited to tell you a bit more about it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, obviously, like I don't really personally know a crazy amount about the American Civil War. I mean, I was, like you say, it's never really taught in the UK and nor in New Zealand. So it was not something that I ever covered. It's obviously something that you kind of know it happened, but like I don't think your average Brit would have a very clear understanding of kind of the contributing factors other than kind of the slavery angle. Which is obviously kind of like the most like notorious one. But I definitely think it's interesting though when you look at, I mean, this is just coming from a perspective of someone who kind of has a very basic understanding. But when you see kind of the way that the Confederate flag kind of appears in current day American culture, especially like in the southern states, it's interesting to me that, like, given the obviously civil wars are brutal and they're very divisive and they cause a lot of different consequences. I mean, obviously that civil wars have happened in almost every single country, so it's nothing new. But the way that you get kind of like you kind of mentioned, like neo-Confederate supporters or people, the way that they kind of presented is very odd, I think, like in the sense that obviously you had a civil war hundreds of years ago, your side lost, but you're still kind of repping them in a way, and it's also interesting from the perspective of like a European, because I guess we can't really translate it into anything equivalent on our side, right? Because obviously the English Civil War was, I can't remember the exact dates, I believe it was 1600s,
1640s, yeah.
But like, can you imagine, like,
and also the English Civil War is to our modern mind quite obscure in its actual motives, and because it's got a sort of religious element to it. It's got Parliament versus the King. It's all sort of questions that have been settled for a long time that we don't really think about. Whereas the American Civil War, because it's still less than 200 years old. I mean, it's really only it's only
it's very in the great scheme of things, it's recent
years old
history
now. 170 years old, I suppose. It goes right to the core of American identity and American history. After it's there's a historian called Barbara Fields who's in the great documentary by Ken Burns, The American Civil War, which for my money is the greatest documentary ever made. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And I was revisiting it a little bit in preparation for this. And she says something to the effect of the Civil War was the culmination of the founding fathers creating a country, creating a constitution that still had slavery at its core. So, equality to all men except certain men. So the fact that was left, that was a sort of string, it was a loose end left in the constitution, put the country on a kind of inexorable path towards the Civil War, because at some point that question had to be closed, because for various reasons you had those in the North who wanted to do away with it, and those in the South who were very much determined to keep it, both for economic and kind of cultural reasons. So all of that is to say that it's an essential part of kind of modern American identity, and of course, it goes right to the heart of racial politics, which are constantly flaring up in the States, and you can trace it all back to the Civil War.
Yeah, and I think that's also another thing we sometimes forget with the US as well, is that in the scheme of things, it's a very young country.
Massively,
it's not the youngest, but it's still only a few hundred years or so. And at this
crazy point, and at the point of the Civil War was very young, was less than a century old. And there was somebody said, I can't remember who, that there were men who who were born and who saw that the America founded, who had the Civil War had the North not won and had not reabsorbed the South into its federal body. They may have. So it was during the war that this guy said it because he wasn't sure which way it was going to go. That there were men who had seen it born and who may see the Union die within their own lifetime, which is an extraordinary thought. That I think we think of sort of when we think of short-lived not so much countries but sort of regimes, we think of sort of Nazi Germany. There's the 12 years I think is probably one of the shortest out there.
Also, well, I was going to say you probably also I'd probably say like Weimar Germany as well.
Yes, even
which is kind of like it holds the promise of something so different, and then kind of just collapses in on itself because there were too many warring factions and
of course. So at the point at which this war took place, the country was very, very young, and it was still, as we'll get onto in a minute, it was still nailing out exactly what it meant to both to be a country, to be a collection of individual states. Because we always forget, I think, over here, because we are one. Well, we've got the United Kingdom, so we're obviously we're a collection of countries within a broader country, but we're also. So because of that, because we've had this long-standing kind of union that we're in, we forget, I think, the complexities of having a federation, essentially, of different states, all of whom have their own sort of trajectories and ideas and agendas. And at this time, only sort of half of the states were actually formed and functional that we now of the 50 that we now have. Only sort of 20-something were actually states, and the west of the country was a sort of map onto which lines were still being drawn.
Yeah.
So that is essential as well to remember that kind of it's still a country in formation. It's still a nascent. It still hasn't got its full lines drawn at that point.
Yeah. Because I guess, they're only kind of at the beginning of that, manifest destiny kind of journey.
Quite. Well, we'll get onto that very shortly.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Exactly.
But I'm excited.
We may as well start there. I think your first. Well, I'll let you ask your first question, Tui.
Yeah, I mean, to kick things off, I mean, obviously, civil wars don't just happen. There's always kind of like a build-up, and there's lots of different factors that lead towards an actual armed conflict. So I guess starting off, like, people know that the American Civil War happened, but people might not know, what caused the majority of the tension. Kind of how did the build-up look to the conflict?
Yeah. So essentially, it comes down to the presidency of James K. Polk, who coined the famous. I don't know if he coined it himself, but he was a big proponent of "quote unquote" manifest destiny, which was the notion that America had this kind of God-given, not only right but duty to expand into as much of the North American continent as it possibly could. So it was a very kind of aggressive, expansionist way of thinking, and it led to the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, which is essentially it's interesting to think that Mexico, of all places, would be kind of the seed of the American Civil War, but it is because you have this very successfully waged war in which an enormous amount of territory is won off of Mexico. And to go back a little bit, to rewind slightly, the key is always in the Senate, in the Capitol in Washington. Both northern and southern representatives are constantly stressing about what the kind of balance of power is between North and South. So whenever territory is added, there's this whole kind of hullabaloo about, well, okay, what is it? Is it a free state or is it a slave state? So you have the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which is a law that's passed that admits Missouri on the one hand as a slave state, but then also at the same time adds Maine as a free state. So there's a constant attempt in Congress in order to keep the peace between North and South, to always have on the one hand something for the Northerners, on the one hand something for the Southerners. I.e., on the one hand something for the abolitionist side of the argument, and something on the other hand for the pro-slavery side.
Right.
And as part of that package, slavery was banned in all the territory north of the 3630 parallel that was drawn out in the Louisiana Purchase. So basically, it's a sort of line in the sand of, okay, fine, Missouri, slave state, great, whatever. Above this line, any state that is admitted will be a free state. But south of that, you have this interesting thing of there being, when a state is admitted as a slave state, or as a free state too, there is still the option for the people within that state to decide amongst themselves what they want it to be. And that's what takes us to Bleeding Kansas, because Kansas is, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, and it basically repeals, as I was saying there, it repeals the Missouri Compromise in the sense of allowing popular sovereignty to determine slavery in the new territory. So it kind of wipes out that idea that you have, this is a free state, this is a slave state, because it allows people within it. Of course, what that results in is a massive amount of violence, because as you have people moving westward, you have both free soilers, so there's a party called the Free Soilers, and they are people who believe it should be a free state, but you also have Democrats who are pro-slavery coming in, and they clash massively. And famously, for years and years, there was this extraordinary violence that broke out in Kansas between the two factions, and that's when we have John Brown coming on the scene, who is this sort of evangelical. He's sort of mad. He has this kind of divine sort of wrath about him. He thinks he's kind of God's agent on earth, and he's been put there to destroy the institution of slavery. And he and his sons hack to death 5 pro-slavery men in Kansas as part of this kind of maniacal sort of messianic drive to wipe out slavery and anybody who thinks that it should go ahead. But I'll pause there, and I'll let you. Are there any questions you have there before I kind of charge on?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much of a question. I think it's more like, I mean, in terms of obviously when the states were being kind of added, you mentioned they did have this kind of system in place to kind of try and keep it balanced mostly. So you would always add kind of, for every one free state, you'd get a slave state as well. Yeah. But obviously going into, I mean, if we look at the US today, obviously states have their own government, they have their own kind of Senate and stuff. Like, obviously there's the federal government that decides, like the really big stuff. But I think it's interesting that it kind of obviously devolves into this system of local governments that kind of just decide what they want to be. But yeah. I guess when you're looking at, say, like, you come off the back of the Mexican conflict, and vast amounts of this land have been gained in the South. Like, who's populating that? I guess then you don't have there's no system for them to control who's going into which state, and then obviously who then becomes the majority of the decision-making bodies, because you're thinking about geographical proximity. Like, if people are living in slave states in the South and they're pro-slavery, and then they go and create a new state that's like right next door, they're probably not going to be wanting, like, abolitionists like living next to them, they're going to be like,
Well,
oh
quite.
no, it's our land.
And crucially, they're taking their property, i.e., human beings, with them. And there is this period, even in free states that are admitted, where I can't remember the word. There's a specific word for it, but basically, a sojourn. It's called a sojourn. So a slave owner who moves into what's to become a free state, whilst it's still in the process of becoming that state, and things are still being decided. All of these grants, these sort of sojourn grants, are given out to slaveholders to basically say, well, you can go while we're still working all of this kind of stuff out, you can still go ahead. So basically, it's a free pass to them to continue practicing slavery, even in a quote unquote free state, because how are you going to enforce any of this kind of stuff until you have sort of militias and courts and all this kind of stuff. It's all very frontier, like Bleeding Kansas. It's total frontier justice. It's people just taking the question into their own hands. There's no law and order. It's just absolute anarchy.
Well, that's the other thing to think about as well when you're looking at this whole scenario, because we've already mentioned the US was still forming at that point in time, and
it's very much still the Wild West.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, we see some films about it, and we think, oh yeah, that was just like this random period in time. But it's like, no, this was happening at a very formative period of the US
completely
in their history.
Yeah, completely. And that takes me to California, which is an important one too, because the gold rush of '48 in California is a real catalyst for all of this, because there'd been questions over, is it going to be a free state? Is it not going to be a free state? But of course, when you suddenly have people flooding there to mine for gold, the first thing people think is, great, we'll use slave labor to mine the gold. That's going to be what we do. So of course, this question immediately crops up and is pushed to the forefront. So there is a thing called the Compromise of 1850. A lot of compromises here. We've got the Missouri Compromise as well as the Compromise of 1850, which is a package of 5 bills that included the admission of California as a free state. So they decided that California would be a free state. But as a way of balancing it out, I believe it's, I might have to fact check myself on this in a minute, but Utah and New Mexico are both admitted as slave states. Right. And on top of that as well, there is a thing called the Fugitive Slave Act, which is a very, very controversial bill, but it basically means that runaway slaves can be recaptured by their owners. And northern citizens, even more crucially than that, northern citizens, because obviously slaves fleeing on the Underground Railroad, which of course is not literally, some people sometimes think it is, but it's not a literal Underground Railroad. It's in the dead of night, people being kind of spirited away between different houses of people, sort of safe houses, to get them slowly kind of pinballing their way up north to freedom. Yeah. But say they got all the way to Boston, which was a real sort of heart of abolitionism, a great place to be if you're a runaway slave. Your owner could come after you, and the northern citizens of Boston would be compelled legally to assist you in recapturing your property. Of course, it is massively beneficial to the slave owners in the sense that, because slaves don't have any kind of documentation, they don't have any papers, it's basically just a license to kidnap. So there were endless, and the whole story of 12 Years a Slave, which is obviously a fabulous movie, but based on the memoir by Solomon Northup. He was a free man who had never been a slave in the North and was kidnapped under the Fugitive Slave Act and taken down to the South, and claimed, it was simply claimed by the planter that he was a runaway, and of course he had no way of proving otherwise, because who's going to listen to him?
Yeah.
I mean, he was a massively educated man and very literate, but you've got to think most slaves were not. I mean, how on earth would they be able to convince anybody, not being able to read or write or any of the rest of it, and certainly not having any kind of documentation? So it's a very, very controversial act, because it angers Northerners, because they feel like, hang on a minute, we here do not practice this abomination. Why should we be asked to assist those who do? And in Boston in particular, there's some great stories of local sort of clergymen and all sorts arming themselves and protecting, quite fiercely protecting runaway slaves who they were sheltering in their homes. Very, very moving. Lots of brilliant stories there of helping them to get to then on to Canada or to Britain or elsewhere. Where's that got us to?
Well, actually,
I'd
say the next part would be more in terms of like how we've kind of covered geography a little bit in terms of the split. Obviously, we all know that the split is between North and South. But in terms of kind of how the factions set up, how does this look? I mean, obviously, it can be a bit more complicated than it just being like just one line through the country, and then you say one side fighting one side, and then the other one is also a different side. So I guess can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so inevitably, of course, it's never as simple as simply everybody above a certain line thinks one way and everybody below a certain line thinks the others. During the war, you had what were called copperheads, who were northerners who were pro-South and thought that they should if the South wanted to go their own way and secede from the Union, that they should be allowed to, whether or not they believed that slavery was wrong. But anyway, you have the sort of upper North and the lower South, who are at the two kind of poles, essentially. So the upper North are the most aggressively abolitionist, and the lower South are the most aggressively pro-slavery. But that also has to do with geography. Geography, I don't mean in the sense of North and South, but geography in the sense of how the land is made up, because
and the economies of the two sides as well.
Yeah, precisely. So the upper North is very, very industrial, and the lower South is fully agrarian, kind of cotton planting. But then you have an interesting thing happening in the middle, where you have the upper South and the lower North, which are slightly more mixed economies, and especially in the upper South, you can't grow because the Appalachians come running through North Carolina, where I'm from, in a little town called Asheville, which is way up in the sort of north west of the state.
And the Appalachians are a mountain range, for anyone who doesn't know as well.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Let's go really basic. Yeah. The Appalachians are a beautiful, beautiful mountain range. If anybody's ever seen The Last of the Mohicans, it's actually filmed around my neck of the woods, North Carolina, even though it's set up in the New York portion of the Appalachian Mountains, because they stretch all the way down from sort of New York all the way through to Alabama, where they kind of peter out. So when you look at maps, I was looking at one today, of the crops that are grown in the South, you have this kind of empty patch where nothing is being grown, and that is where the mountains run through. So the upper South is naturally much more ambivalent about slavery, because if you're a sort of farmer in the mountains somewhere, and it's a sort of hard scrabble existence and you can't really grow anything, you're not exactly going to be profiting from slavery, because you even if you had the money to, which you probably don't, you wouldn't be able to grow. You wouldn't be able to grow anything. You wouldn't be able to grow cotton, which is of course the great crop. Inevitably in the upper South, and not only that, but not only is it not beneficial to you, but it's actually detrimental to you, because slave labour is obviously unwaged labour, so it is undercutting your own work. If you're trying to grow something and you're in competition with somebody who, although you wouldn't really be able to grow very much, if you're trying to compete against somebody who doesn't have to pay their employees, or not employees, slaves, then of course you're going to really despise them, and that's the case for a lot of labourers in the South who are not operating with slaves but actually having to pay employees. It's not it's detrimental to the way you run things.
Mm-hmm.
So and then again in the lower north, it's a similar sort of situation, but sort of from the other side of the coin. There, they have maybe family or people they know from over the border, because of course it's essentially just an arbitrary line that just runs through the middle of the country. The Mason-Dixon line is what it starts from. So you're not going to necessarily think all that terribly of your friends and neighbours and possibly family who might just happen to be south of the border practicing slavery because you've grown up. And Maryland is a classic case because it's right on that line. So within Maryland, you have both sides of the coin. You have slavers and abolitionists in the same living sort of cheek by jowl.
Mm.
So inevitably there's this kind of grey area in the middle. So that's how it divides sort of north to south. But then you also so the parties themselves are split down the middle factionally into the sort of pro and anti-slavery factions of the party. So the reason that the Republicans get in with Abraham Lincoln in 1860, and they're a brand new party at this point. I mean, it's a remarkable feat when you think of it. And inevitably, they weren't even on the ballot in the South, because who the hell in the South is going to vote for
abolitionists?
a sort of soft abolitionist party? So you had the Free Soilers and the Liberty Party, who were teeny tiny parties, who were the kind of more extreme abolitionist parties, but the Republicans were sort of softer, and Lincoln was a great kind of pragmatist when it came to all of that. He knew how to play both sides, because as a lawyer from Springfield, Illinois, before that he had represented people. He had represented owners of slaves who'd run away, and he'd also represented the runaway slaves themselves in different instances. So he could see all sides of the question. He himself believed that slavery was wrong, but he wasn't like a sort of John Brown. He wasn't a fiery abolitionist by any means.
Right.
So basically, the division, the split that happens in the Democrat Party, opens the way for the Republicans to slide in and take a load of votes. So he wins, I think, on 40% of the vote, which is pretty remarkable given that he's not even on the ballot.
Yeah.
In about half the states.
That's pretty crazy.
Pretty extraordinary. But of course, the election of him as president only acts as a catalyst for what are called fire eaters, those Southerners who are very vocal and angry about what they see as northern aggression against their states' rights. Of course, the election of Lincoln is a real stab, a real kind of sticks in the craw for them, because they go, oh God, now we're really gonna be under threat of losing our way of life, and it all comes down to the way as well in which the societies are run, because they kind of couldn't be more different. You've got the north is industrial, so it's all about people moving to cities in the traditional way and trying to earn a living working in factories and all the rest of it. But in the South, you have this kind of strange, almost quasi sort of feudal existence. They see trade, they see industrialization as very sort of grubby, and they think of themselves as kind of aristocrats in the sort of British model. And there are certain overlaps there's certain sympathies here in Britain with the South. And of course, we use an enormous amount of their cotton in our mills as well. But it's interesting because all the cotton that's being grown in the South, because they basically that's all they do is they just grow cotton, tobacco, sugar, various other crops as well. But they have no means, they have no industrial base with which to actually produce products from these raw materials. So what actually happens is they end up, most of everything that they use in the South is essentially imported from the North. So even the cotton that they grow, they sell to northern manufacturers who will make clothes that they then buy back. So by the time they've done all of that, they're not really making money, because they've got this strange import-export thing. And it's the same thing with Britain.
No, so
I was just going to say it's the same with. It's even worse in the case of, because they're selling so much to us, that we're using it, but then when we put it on our boats, put clothes and things and whatever from that we've made with it on the boats to sell back to the Americans, because a huge amount of trade could be done in the north versus in the south, the British ships actually they won't land in southern ports because they won't make as much money. So they land in northern ports and they sell to the north, who then so then if the southerners want those products, they then have to pay an extra fee to get that transported down to them. It's a bit like the grain that we were talking about before. You know, in the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
The further away you get,
doubles in price every
the more
50
doubles
miles.
in price. Yeah. So they had gotten themselves in this really difficult bind, and even when they realised this and they started to try and invest in industrialising, it was seen to go against the grain of kind of southern culture, the southern way of life, because it was seen to be very grubby and kind of mercantile. The southerners didn't take to it, they didn't like it, they didn't want it, so they sort of stubbornness is a huge factor in the sort of southern character.
And
they
human
were
history.
Massively stubborn. Yeah, well, human history too, yeah. But they just refused to change, they refused to modernise, and it led them on a kind of inexorable path towards the war, because they just refused to sort of move with the times. So you had completely different societies, and it was that, you know, had they industrialized more, they might have seen reason when it came to abolishing slavery. But because they're so heavily invested in this model, even the sort of more moderates and there were plenty of moderates, like Robert E. Lee himself was no fan of slavery, and he was the greatest general who fought for the South. Even the moderates couldn't bring, you know, psychologically couldn't bring themselves to do away with it, because it was the basis upon which the entire society ran itself.
Yeah, I mean, we see that kind of process play out a lot of times, because I guess we kind of covered it a bit in our Empire episodes as well. But with, you know, you have to also consider that at this period of time, this is a period of time where the world is changing a lot in a very short space of time. Obviously, industrialization was well in full flow across Europe and in the north as well, which fundamentally changed the way that society worked. You know, like, so that there's so many instances of different places that kind of stubbornly hold on to the world order that they knew and that has worked for them up to that point, but failing to change with the times kind of then dooms you to an existence of kind of forever chasing something that's never coming back, in a way. Completely. It's also interesting because I think when people like think about, you know, the Civil War, or they think about other kind of historical events, you can hypothesize kind of how things might have been different if something went, you know, one thing changed. What if the Confederates won the war instead? And kind of how the world would look differently, or how America would look differently. But it's interesting because the role of Britain, and I'm sure we're going to cover it a bit later as well, but like the role of Britain in this is also interesting because from what I've seen from just like doing my own research, just ahead of like us talking about it, is that obviously one of the biggest hypothetical points is, oh well, what if Britain really just threw all their weight behind the South, to like, you know, prop them up and help them win the war and everything. But what people sometimes, I think, don't realize is that, well, sure, like, Britain definitely had a vested interest in stunting American economic growth, to sort of maintain their own hegemony over the world in that way. But at the same time, they had a thriving trade economy and sort of trade relationship with the North, in the sense that obviously we mentioned kind of the supply chain in the sense that the South would supply the cotton and other raw materials to British and European factories. The British factories then pump out all the products, which then get sold to the Northern American consumers and companies and businesses and so on. But overall, like the relationship between the Union and Britain is kind of, I think, assumed to be mega negative when I don't necessarily think that that's the case at all.
No, and it was very much the case. Palmerston himself was, he was quite fiery actually. He was quite pro South in the sense that there was a moment when 2 Confederates were arrested by Union forces on a British boat. And it created a diplomatic incident because Palmerston said, he basically said, "I'm going to go to war with you if you don't release these guys because they're free citizens doing what they want to do." And Palmerston actually sent, I think it was 17,000 troops to Canada. He actually dispatched them because he thought this could heat up and we may actually have to fight the North. So Lincoln famously said, one war at a time, and he kind of quietly let the 2 Confederate guys go because he thought, I can't be handling a war on 2 fronts here. You know? So Palmerston himself was quite, was sort of putting his money where his mouth was. But yes, as you say, they don't really, if they can avoid it, they don't want to sour relations with the North because the North is, although they're getting an enormous amount of cotton from the South, which is
they get a lot of money from the North.
Yes, exactly. They get a lot. They're doing the actual trade with the North, so they have to kind of play both sides. And part of the calculation, which it may be another episode, it may be later in this one that we get to it, but the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln puts out he puts it out in 1862, but it's to take effect at the beginning of 1863. Part of the calculation there is that he wants it to be made clear that if anybody comes to the aid of the South, they will be committing a crime because the South are now, not only committing a crime, but morally it makes it very difficult because Britain itself has obviously abolished the slave trade long before William Wilberforce and all that. So it's a calculation by Lincoln to stop foreign powers getting involved on the side of the South, but by upping the stakes essentially. So it's everything Lincoln does is a calculation. Even those great moral victories that he makes, that he gets, like the Emancipation Proclamation, there's always a sort of, in the background, a kind of diplomatic or sort of economic aim rumbling away as well, because he's an enormously clever man as well as being very compassionate and moral.
So yeah, I mean, to be fair, actually, I've got another question that just came up as well. Was like, obvious. I'm not entirely clear on the exact timelines of the war and kind of the sense of how long it took and when it started and everything. But obviously, we were talking about how the states weren't fully formed yet. Like they hadn't fully kind of expanded to their current extent, let's say. So while the war was kind of going on, was there like still expansion going on into the West, or was that kind of put on hold?
Yeah, there was. No, there was, and it was much more of a frontier war out in the West. There was a whole Western theatre. It doesn't often get looked at because it's a little bit more. It's not quite as essential as the Eastern theatre, because the Eastern theatre is all based around the 2 capitals, Washington and the new capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, and Washington's in Maryland and Richmond's in Virginia, and those 2 are right next to each other. I mean, they are like just over the Potomac River, kind of cuts in between, but they are really right next to each other. It is remarkable how close the 2 capitals are. So all the fighting in the Eastern Theatre, well, not all of it, but a lot of the fighting happens in Virginia and Maryland because everybody is trying to get to the other one's capital to force the surrender. So of course they're going back and forth, and they're sort of squiggly. If you map out the battles, it's all kind of squiggly and all over the place because they're just fighting over the same. It's a bit like Vietnam. There's no clear kind of geographical. We're going that way and you're going that way. They're fighting over the same bits of land over and over again. There was one town in Virginia, I can't remember the name of it, that apparently changed hands 74 times during the war.
Oh my God.
So I mean, you must be, if you were a resident of that town, you would be absolutely exhausted.
You'd have, but you just have both flags waiting in your closet.
Yeah. Basically, you'd be like, "What today are we? Okay, right, we're
just look outside and see what the soldiers are wearing."
Yeah, you'd be whistling Dixie one day and the Battle Hymn of the Republic the next. But yeah, depending on the day. But you mentioned he gets intelligence that Lee is nearby, and he has the opportunity to catch him completely off guard. And even with this intelligence, he refuses to deploy his troops. And so Lincoln famously sent him a letter where he says, if you're not using your army, would you mind if I borrowed it? Southern Gothic is an interesting psychological thing that springs out of this utter devastation that the South experiences.
Yeah, it's one of the unfortunate realities of the world we live in, that war brings such innovation and such kind of, creativity.
Technology. The lands awkwardly breaks his foot as he lands on stage, and he cries out, "Sic semper tyrannis." So, thus is it always to tyrants. They ostensibly get their 40 acres and a mule. Something that Kendrick Lamar puts in several of his songs, I've noticed. Life is by no means improved. It's a tough existence. Afterwards, he says the war started in my front yard and it ended in my front parlour. So